The morning sun cut through the Afghan dust like amber glass, casting long shadows across forward operating base Shank. To anyone watching, Warrant Officer Kestrel Ghost Nakamura was just another support personnel making her rounds, water bottles clinking in the canvas sack slung over her shoulder, boots scuffing against the hard-pan dirt. Her slight frame moved with practiced invisibility through the maze of blast walls and razor wire, drawing barely a glance from the infantry marines preparing for their morning patrol brief. Captain Derek Morrison barely looked up from his tactical map when she approached his command post. The water delivery was routine, expected, forgettable, but something made him pause as she set the bottles down, a fluid economy of movement that didn't match her mundane task. His eyes tracked to her left shoulder, where the fabric of her ACU blouse had shifted slightly in the dry wind. There, sewn with military precision above her name tape, was a black and yellow tab that shouldn't have been there. Not on someone carrying water. Not on someone the other soldiers called the quiet one when they bothered to acknowledge her at all. Ranger, Morrison said, the single word hanging in the air like a challenge. Ghost's dark eyes met his for the first time in 3 months of water deliveries. No explanation, no justification, just a slight nod that carried the weight of things unspoken. Airborne Ranger, she corrected quietly, her voice carrying a trace of something that might have been amusement. 3rd Battalion, 75th Regiment. The command post fell silent. Staff Sergeant Williams looked up from his radio checks. Lieutenant Chen stopped mid-sentence in his equipment inventory. Even the constant chatter from the TOC seemed to pause, as if the base itself was holding its breath. Morrison studied her face, angular cheekbones weathered by more than just this deployment, eyes that had seen things water carriers shouldn't see. The puzzle pieces were clicking together in his mind, but none of them made sense. Rangers didn't carry water. Rangers led raids, cleared compounds, brought the fight to the enemy in the darkest hours before dawn. "What are you doing here, Ghost?" The question carried layers of meaning that went far beyond her presence at his command post. She shouldered the empty water sack with the same fluid motion that had first caught his attention. "Staying hydrated, sir." A pause. "Keeping others hydrated." As she turned to leave, Morrison caught a glimpse of something else, a small silver pendant that had shifted outside her undershirt. Wings. Jump wings, worn smooth by years of contact with skin and fabric. But these weren't just any wings. These were pilots' wings, and they were old. The morning patrol brief would have to wait. Captain Morrison had questions that needed answers, and Ghost Nakamura had secrets that were about to surface in the unforgiving light of the Afghan sun. 3 hours later, the first Taliban rocket screamed over the perimeter wall and exploded in a shower of concrete and shrapnel. The attack wasn't random. The accuracy was too precise, the timing too perfect. Someone had been watching Fob Shank, learning its rhythms, mapping its vulnerabilities. As alarms wailed and soldiers scrambled for defensive positions, Morrison realized that Ghost's water deliveries might not have been as innocent as they appeared. She moved through the chaos like smoke given form, no longer carrying water but something far more deadly. The M4 carbine in her hands looked natural, familiar, as if it had been waiting there all along. Her movements were different now, predatory, purposeful. This wasn't the hesitant shuffle of support personnel caught in a firefight. This was the fluid dance of someone who had been trained to kill efficiently and without hesitation. "Ghost, what's your position?" Morrison's voice crackled over the radio net, but she was already gone. Staff Sergeant Williams spotted her first, moving along the eastern wall with the kind of tactical awareness that came from years of training most soldiers would never receive. She wasn't running from the fight, she was positioning herself for it. The rocket attack had been a probe, testing their defenses, drawing their attention, but Ghost seemed to understand something the rest of them didn't. "6, this is Overwatch." Her voice came through the radio, calm and professional. The call sign was new, but the tone was ancient. the voice of someone who had done this dance before, in places where the rules of engagement were written in blood rather than regulation manuals. I have eyes on secondary position. Grid 41, SMB 12,345, 67,890. Recommend immediate indirect fire mission. Morrison's blood went cold. Those coordinates were outside their established perimeter, in terrain that shouldn't have been visible from any defensive position on the base. Unless someone was somewhere they weren't supposed to be. Unless someone had been watching, waiting, learning. The second wave of rockets confirmed her assessment. They came from exactly where she had called the coordinates, streaking across the morning sky with deadly precision. But this time, Fob Shank was ready. Counterbattery fire lit up the distant ridgeline in flowers of orange flame and black smoke. When the dust settled and the last echoes of gunfire faded into the mountain silence, Morrison found Ghost sitting on an equipment crate, cleaning her weapon with the methodical precision of a craftsman maintaining a favored tool. The Ranger tab on her shoulder seemed to glow in the filtered sunlight, no longer a curiosity but a declaration. "How long have you been watching them?" Morrison asked. Ghost looked up from her weapon, and for the first time since he'd known her, she smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. 3 months, sir, same as they've been watching us." The briefing room that afternoon felt different. Word had spread through the base with the efficiency of military gossip, but this wasn't the usual rumor mill churning out speculation about mail delivery or chow hall schedules. This was something that cut deeper, challenging assumptions that had been comfortable in their certainty. The water carrier was a Ranger. The quiet one had pilot's wings. The woman they had barely noticed had been conducting a counter-surveillance operation that none of them had been aware of. Morrison spread the tactical maps across the plywood table, weighted down with empty ammunition cans that still smelled of cordite from the morning's engagement. Ghost stood at the far end of the room, no longer invisible but not quite integrated into the command structure either. She existed in a space between recognition and acceptance, like a ghost made partially solid. "Walk me through it," Morrison said. Ghost stepped forward, her finger tracing routes across the map with the confidence of someone who had walked every meter of the terrain in question. "Taliban observation post here." She indicated a ridge approximately 800 meters from the base perimeter. "Secondary position here. Communication relay approximately 2 clicks north. They've been running a textbook surveillance pattern, rotating personnel every 72 hours. Lieutenant Chen leaned forward, studying the markings she had made. "How do you know their rotation schedule?" "Because I've been watching them watch us." Ghost's reply was matter-of-fact, as if conducting solo reconnaissance operations was as natural as delivering water. "They're good, but they're predictable. Military training leaves patterns, even when you're trying to avoid them." Staff Sergeant Williams crossed his arms, skepticism written across his weathered face. "And you learned this carrying water bottles." Ghost's smile was thin as a blade. "Water carriers go everywhere, Sergeant. Nobody questions where you're going or why you need to be there. Perfect cover for reconnaissance." She paused, her dark eyes scanning the faces around the table. "Besides, I wasn't always carrying water." Morrison felt the pieces clicking together like rounds sliding into a magazine. "What did you fly?" "AH-64D Apache Longbow," Ghost replied without hesitation. 5 deployments: Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya. 237 combat hours before. She trailed off, her fingers unconsciously touching the silver wings beneath her uniform blouse. "Before what?" Morrison pressed. The silence stretched like a taut wire. Outside, the afternoon wind carried the smell of diesel fuel and dust, the permanent perfume of military outposts in hostile territory. Ghost's eyes found the window, staring out at the mountains that held secrets in every shadow and fold. "Before I killed 17 Taliban fighters in a single engagement and realized I was good at it," she said quietly. "Too good at it." The weight of her words settled over the briefing room like snow, cold and transformative. Morrison had heard rumors of the Kandahar engagement, a single Apache that had held off an entire Taliban company while evacuating a trapped special operations team. The pilot had been recommended for the Distinguished Flying Cross, then had mysteriously transferred to a support role and disappeared into the administrative machinery of the military bureaucracy. Kandahar Province, October 15, 2021, Morrison said. The piece is finally forming a complete picture. Ghost nodded, her expression unreadable. 3 hours of continuous combat, 30mm chain gun, Hellfire missiles, and when those ran dry, I used the aircraft itself as a weapon. Made 17 passes through ground fire that should have brought me down. She paused, her hands steady despite the memories she was excavating. The Taliban called me Death's Shadow after that day. Staff Sergeant Williams uncrossed his arms, his skepticism melting into something approaching respect. Why water detail? Why here? Because killing 17 men in 3 hours changes you, Ghost replied simply. Because when the shooting stopped, I realized I had enjoyed it. Not the victory, not the successful mission, the killing itself. That scared me more than any Taliban fighter ever could. Morrison understood now why she had requested the transfer, why a decorated combat pilot was carrying water bottles on a remote forward operating base. She wasn't hiding from the enemy. She was hiding from herself. But the morning's attack had drawn her back into the fight, and the transformation had been as swift as it was inevitable. The observation posts are still active, Ghost continued, returning to the tactical situation with professional detachment. They're planning something bigger than probing attacks. The secondary positions I identified suggest they're preparing for a coordinated assault, probably during the new moon in 4 days. Lieutenant Chen studied the map, following her markings with growing concern. Battalion needs to know about this, if they're planning a major attack. Battalion won't believe it, Morrison interrupted. Not coming from a water carrier, no matter what tabs she's wearing. He looked at Ghost directly. What do you recommend? Ghost was quiet for a long moment, her eyes distant with calculation. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who had faced impossible odds and emerged victorious through a combination of skill, determination, and controlled violence. We don't wait for Battalion to make the decision, she said. We take the fight to them first. Morrison felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Afghan mountain air. He was looking at a woman who had voluntarily stepped back from the edge of something dark and necessary, only to find herself being pulled back toward it by circumstances beyond her control. The question wasn't whether she was capable of what she was suggesting. The question was whether any of them were ready for what she might become in the process. That night, Fob Shank transformed from a routine support installation into something resembling a special operations planning cell. Ghost had shed her water carrier persona like a snake shedding old skin, revealing layers of tactical knowledge and operational experience that most of the soldiers on the base could only imagine. She moved through the command post with quiet authority, making suggestions that sounded more like orders softly delivered. Primary observation post has 3 personnel, rotating every 8 hours. She briefed the assembled team leaders, her voice steady and professional. They're using a Toyota Hilux for transportation, gray primer with battle damage on the left rear quarter panel. Communication equipment appears to be Chinese PRC-152 variants, probably supplied through Pakistan. Morrison watched the faces around the improvised conference table. The initial skepticism had given way to something approaching awe as Ghost continued to demonstrate an encyclopedic knowledge of enemy capabilities and intentions. This wasn't guesswork or lucky observation. This was the product of months of systematic intelligence gathering, conducted by someone who understood both sides of the tactical equation. Secondary position has heavier weapons, Ghost continued, marking positions on the map with surgical precision. PKM machine gun, possibly an RPG-29. They're positioned to provide overwatch for the primary site and cover routes of withdrawal. Classic Soviet doctrine adapted for asymmetric warfare. Staff Sergeant Williams leaned forward, studying the terrain features she had marked. How do we know they're not just random harassment positions? Ghost's smile was cold as mountain wind. Because harassment doesn't require a communication relay positioned to coordinate with positions outside their immediate area of operations. This is part of something larger. The radio crackled to life, interrupting the briefing with a transmission from the Battalion Tactical Operations Center. Morrison recognized the voice of Major Blackwood, the battalion operations officer, whose patience with forward operating bases had worn thin over multiple deployments. "Shank 6, this is Dragon 6, the radio squawked. "What's your status on the morning's engagement?" Morrison keyed the handset, choosing his words carefully. "Dragon 6, engagement successfully repelled. No friendly casualties, enemy casualties unknown. We have developed intelligence indicating follow-on attacks are likely." A pause. Static filled the silence like white noise, carrying the weight of decisions being made at higher headquarters. "Copy all, Shank 6. Maintain defensive posture and submit intelligence reports through normal channels." Morrison looked at Ghost, who was shaking her head with an expression of grim resignation. Normal channels meant the intelligence would disappear into the bureaucratic machine, analyzed and cross-referenced until its tactical value had evaporated. By the time higher headquarters made a decision, the Taliban would have implemented whatever plan they were developing. "We don't have time for normal channels," Ghost said quietly after Morrison had acknowledged the transmission. "What are you suggesting?" Morrison asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Ghost stood, her silhouette sharp against the maps and charts that covered the briefing room walls. "I'm suggesting we remind them why they used to call me Death Shadow." The pre-dawn darkness wrapped around Fob Shank like a familiar blanket, carrying the scent of dust and diesel fuel that had become the olfactory signature of modern warfare. Ghost moved through the motor pool with practiced silence, her footsteps muffled by years of training that had been dormant but never forgotten. The night vision goggles transformed the world into shades of green and gray, revealing a landscape of military vehicles and equipment that most soldiers saw as tools of logistics and support. Ghost saw weapons waiting to be employed. "Overwatch to Shank 6, her voice whispered through the radio net, professional and calm. "I'm in position for reconnaissance phase." Morrison's response crackled back immediately, betraying the tension that had kept him awake through the night. "Copy, Overwatch. Remember, this is intelligence gathering only." Ghost smiled in the darkness, knowing that Morrison understood the fluid nature of reconnaissance operations in hostile territory. Intelligence gathering had a way of becoming direct action when the tactical situation demanded it. She had learned that lesson in the mountains above Kandahar, where the line between observation and engagement had blurred beyond recognition. The rocky outcropping she had chosen provided perfect overwatch of the primary Taliban observation post, approximately 600 meters distant through terrain that channeled sound and concealed movement. Through her scope, Ghost could see the faint glow of cigarettes and the occasional movement of figures against the lighter background of the sky. 3 men, just as she had briefed, rotating guard duty with the casual confidence of fighters who believed themselves unobserved. They were wrong. "Shank 6, this is Overwatch," Ghost transmitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have positive identification on primary target. 3 personnel, light weapons, communication equipment active." The radio remained silent for several seconds before Morrison responded. "Copy all, Overwatch. What about secondary position?" Ghost adjusted her scope, scanning the ridge line to the north where she had identified the heavy weapons position. The thermal signature of the PKM machine gun was clearly visible, along with 2 personnel who were trying to remain motionless but failing to account for their body heat signature in the cool mountain air. Secondary position confirmed active, she reported. 2 personnel, heavy weapons as briefed. They're awake and alert. What Ghost didn't report was the third thermal signature she had detected, moving slowly through a gully that connected the 2 positions. A runner, carrying messages between the observation posts with the kind of operational security that suggested professional training. This wasn't a random collection of Taliban fighters harassing a coalition base. This was a coordinated reconnaissance effort being conducted by personnel who understood both surveillance and counter-surveillance techniques. Ghost felt something cold and familiar settling in her chest, like ice forming on still water. The sensation was simultaneously comforting and terrifying, the emotional shutdown that preceded lethal action. She had spent 2 years learning to suppress this feeling, to channel it into constructive outlets that didn't involve high-velocity projectiles and explosive ordnance. But the Taliban weren't giving her that choice. "Shank 6, Ghost transmitted, her voice carrying a new edge that Morrison would recognize from his own combat experience. "Intelligence gathering phase is complete. Recommend immediate transition to direct action." The radio crackled with static before Morrison's voice returned, heavy with the weight of command decisions. "Overwatch, maintain observation. Do not engage without direct authorization." Ghost adjusted her position slightly, settling deeper into the rocks with the patience of a predator who understood that hunting was as much about waiting as it was about killing. The authorization would come. The tactical situation would demand it. And when that moment arrived, she would be ready to remind everyone why some ghosts were better left undisturbed. The authorization came at 3:47 hours, delivered not by Morrison's voice over the radio, but by the distinctive whistle of incoming mortar rounds arcing through the pre-dawn darkness. Ghost pressed herself against the rocky outcropping as the first explosions erupted within Fob Shank's perimeter, orange flowers of flame blooming against the defensive walls with surgical precision that spoke of careful target analysis and professional fire direction. This wasn't the random harassment fire that had characterized previous attacks. This was a deliberate engagement designed to inflict maximum casualties on specific targets within the base. The Taliban had been watching longer than Ghost had realized, cataloging patterns of movement and identifying critical vulnerabilities with the patience of professionals. "All stations, this is Shank 6, Morrison's voice cut through the radio chatter, carrying the controlled urgency of a commander adapting to rapidly changing circumstances. "We are under effective indirect fire from multiple positions. All personnel take cover and prepare for ground assault." Ghost remained motionless against the rocks, her scope trained on the primary observation post where she could see figures moving with increased urgency. The spotters were calling fire missions, adjusting the mortar strikes based on their elevated observation of the target area. Each impact was more accurate than the last, walking closer to the command post and critical infrastructure. "Overwatch to Shank 6, Ghost transmitted, her voice steady despite the explosions echoing off the surrounding mountains. "I have positive identification on fire direction personnel. Request authorization for precision engagement." The radio remained silent for several seconds while another salvo of mortar rounds impacted within the base perimeter. Ghost could hear secondary explosions now, suggesting that the Taliban had successfully targeted fuel or ammunition storage areas. The attack was succeeding, and every second of hesitation meant additional friendly casualties. "Overwatch," Morrison finally responded, his voice tight with the strain of combat leadership. "You are authorized to engage hostile forces conducting fire direction activities. Neutralize the threat." Ghost's breathing slowed as muscle memory took control of her body. The sniper rifle settled into her shoulder with the familiar weight of precisely machined steel and carefully balanced optics. The primary observation post filled her scope, 3 figures clearly visible against the lighter background of the sky. The lead spotter was holding a radio handset, his mouth moving as he called corrections for the next fire mission. He would be the first to die. Ghost's finger found the trigger with the delicate touch of a musician playing a beloved instrument. The weapon fired with a sound like controlled thunder, the muzzle flash briefly illuminating the rocks around her position, before fading back into darkness. 600 meters away, the Taliban spotter pitched backward off the rocky ledge, his radio spinning through the air in a lazy arc that ended in shattering plastic and silence. The second shot followed 3 seconds later, taking the machine gunner at the secondary position before he could react to his companion's death. The PKM fell silent, its distinctive cyclic rate replaced by the more distant sound of the continuing mortar barrage. Ghost chambered a third round and shifted her aim to the communication relay position, where a figure was frantically trying to establish contact with positions outside the immediate area. The rifle spoke again, and the Taliban communication network dissolved into chaos and confusion. Within minutes, the mortar fire had stopped. Without effective spotting and fire direction, the Taliban gunners were firing blind into the darkness, wasting ammunition on empty ground while their intended targets took cover and organized counterattacks. "Shank 6, this is Overwatch," Ghost transmitted, her voice carrying the calm satisfaction of a craftsman who had employed her tools with lethal precision. "Hostile observation posts neutralized. Fire direction network disrupted." Morrison's response carried relief and something else, recognition of capabilities that most soldiers could only imagine. "Outstanding work, Overwatch. Return to base for debrief." Ghost began the careful process of withdrawing from her position, moving through terrain that had been transformed from hunting ground back to empty mountain landscape. But she carried with her the knowledge that the transformation within herself was complete. Death's shadow had returned, and the war would never look the same. The debriefing session 3 hours after sunrise felt like an inversion of reality. Ghost sat at the same plywood table where she had been questioned about water delivery schedules just days before, but now the questions centered on precision shooting techniques and target prioritization methodologies. The transformation in how the other soldiers regarded her was as complete as her own metamorphosis from support personnel to lethal operator. Staff Sergeant Williams studied the after-action report with the careful attention of a man reassessing fundamental assumptions about combat effectiveness. 3 targets, 3 shots, 600 meters plus, he read aloud. In darkness, under indirect fire with no misses. Ghost accepted the implicit praise with the same emotional detachment she had displayed while conducting the engagement. Professional competence was not something that required acknowledgement, it simply was. The targets had presented themselves, the tactical situation had demanded their elimination, and she had applied the appropriate level of force with clinical precision. "The communication relay position concerns me," Morrison said, studying the tactical map that had been updated with Ghost's engagement results. "That suggests coordination with forces outside our immediate area of operations." Lieutenant Chen nodded, tracing potential infiltration routes with his finger. "If they're communicating with external elements, this could be preparation for a larger operation, company level or higher." Ghost listened to the tactical discussion with part of her attention, while another part of her mind processed the emotional undercurrents that swirled through the briefing room like smoke. The other soldiers were looking at her differently now, not with the casual dismissal that had characterized their previous interactions, but with something approaching wariness. They had seen what she was capable of when circumstances demanded lethal action, and that knowledge changed everything about their relationship. She understood their reaction. 2 years ago, she had looked at herself in a mirror and seen something that had frightened her enough to voluntarily step back from combat operations. The woman who had killed 17 Taliban fighters in 3 hours had been someone she wasn't sure she wanted to be, regardless of military necessity or professional excellence. But the mirror had been replaced by circumstances, and the reflection it showed was unchanging. She was what she was, and the war would continue to demand what she could provide. Recommendation for follow-on operations? Morrison asked, directing the question to Ghost with the deference accorded to subject matter experts. Ghost considered the tactical situation with the methodical analysis that had been honed through multiple deployments and hundreds of combat hours. The Taliban had revealed their hand prematurely, exposing their surveillance network and communication procedures in exchange for a single mortar attack that had caused minimal damage. From their perspective, it had been a tactical failure. From her perspective, it had been an intelligence windfall. "They'll re-establish observation within 48 hours, she said with quiet certainty. Different positions, different personnel, but the same basic mission. They need eyes on our operations if they're planning something larger." Morrison leaned forward, recognizing the implication. "And when they do?" Ghost's smile was thin as a blade edge, carrying promises of violence delivered with surgical precision. "We'll be watching them watch us, and this time we won't wait for them to make the first move." The briefing room fell silent as the full implications of her suggestion settled over the assembled soldiers. Ghost wasn't proposing defensive measures or reactive operations. She was suggesting they take control of the tactical initiative and hunt the Taliban surveillance network with the same systematic approach that had made her legendary in previous deployments. Death's Shadow was planning to hunt again, and this time she wouldn't be alone. The second phase began 18 hours later, when satellite intelligence confirmed movement in the mountains north of Fob Shank. Ghost studied the overhead imagery with the focused intensity of a chess master analyzing her opponent's positioning, identifying patterns of movement that revealed both tactical intentions and operational weaknesses. 3 vehicles, moving in convoy formation along this ridgeline. She briefed the expanded planning cell that now included representatives from battalion headquarters. Major Blackwood had arrived via helicopter that morning, bringing with him a small team of intelligence analysts and the kind of skeptical attention that senior officers reserved for situations that deviated from standard operating procedures. "How do we know these are hostile forces?" Blackwood asked, studying the satellite images with professional caution. "Could be civilian traffic or coalition forces conducting operations in our area." Ghost's response carried the patience of someone accustomed to explaining tactical realities to personnel who analyzed warfare from climate-controlled offices. Civilian traffic doesn't move in tactical formation during daylight hours in terrain that offers no commercial value. Coalition forces would have coordinated through proper channels before operating in our sector. She pointed to specific details in the imagery that revealed military patterns. Vehicle spacing indicates concern about mines or improvised explosive devices. Route selection prioritizes concealment over efficiency. Movement timing corresponds to periods when our aerial surveillance assets are committed to other sectors. Major Blackwood studied the evidence with the careful attention of an officer whose career advancement depended on making correct decisions based on incomplete information. The satellite imagery was compelling, but it wasn't conclusive. Modern warfare demanded higher standards of proof before authorizing preemptive strikes against unidentified targets. "What do you recommend for positive identification?" he asked. Ghost had anticipated the question, had already planned for the operational requirements that would satisfy both military necessity and legal constraints. Close reconnaissance, with authority to engage if hostile intent is confirmed. Morrison recognized the tactical implications immediately. Close reconnaissance in enemy-controlled terrain meant inserting personnel within direct fire range of potentially hostile forces. It was inherently dangerous, requiring operators with specialized training and proven competence under extreme stress. "I'll take a team," Staff Sergeant Williams volunteered, displaying the kind of aggressive leadership that infantry non-commissioned officers were expected to demonstrate. Ghost shook her head, her expression carrying the weight of operational experience that couldn't be argued with or dismissed. This requires someone who understands surveillance and counter-surveillance, someone who can identify military patterns and make engagement decisions in real time. The implication was clear, but Major Blackwood needed it stated explicitly for the record. Are you volunteering for the mission? Ghost looked at the satellite imagery again, studying terrain features that would determine success or failure for the operation. The ridgeline offered excellent observation positions but limited routes of withdrawal. Engagement ranges would be extended, requiring precision shooting under field conditions. The Taliban would be alert for surveillance after losing their observation posts, making detection likely and escape difficult. It was exactly the kind of mission she had been trained for, the kind of tactical problem that her unique combination of piloting and ground combat experience had prepared her to solve. 2 years ago, she had walked away from operations like this because she had been frightened by her own competence. Now, circumstances were forcing her to confront that fear. "I'll need a spotter," she said quietly. "Someone who can handle communications and provide security while I'm focused on the primary mission." Morrison studied her face, recognizing the cost of the decision she was making. "Lieutenant Chen volunteers as your spotter." Ghost nodded, accepting the assignment with the same emotional detachment that had characterized all of her tactical decisions since stepping back into combat operations. The mission would succeed or fail based on her ability to apply lethal force with clinical precision, while maintaining the psychological distance necessary for professional effectiveness. Death's shadow was going hunting again, but this time she would carry the weight of command responsibility as well as personal demons that had never been fully exorcised. Plus,